of Hope family. My name is Dr. Joel B. Kemp, and I'm honored to be with you for what is unbelievably our third of our week session looking at the question of the Bible, Blackness, and race in America. It's hard to believe time in that quickly. I'm excited to be back with you. And as always, I want to give a special thank you to Pastor Hale, to the Ray of Hope family, and all those who are working behind the scenes to make this possible. As always, I ask as we go through our conversation, feel free to put your questions, your comments, your consternations in the chat as we go, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. And you'll see me periodically look to the left. The chat is just to make sure I'm staying on top of the questions that are there and look for conversation today. As you see on the screen, our plan is to start with a quick review of what we've done in the first 2 weeks, just as a refresher for some, as an orientation to others who may just be joining. Then after that, we'll move into what I call the 3 Ds of Blackness. This is an idea that I've been developing that tries to summarize how Blackness was misconstructed by a series of racialized interpretations of the biblical text. So we'll spend some time unpacking what I mean by the 3 Ds, and then we'll look at one of the texts that I think is central. Blackness has been mischaracterized in America, and that is the infamous story of Cain's murder of Abel in Genesis 4. So we'll spend some time on each of those. And as I mentioned, as anything pops up, please feel free to put questions, thoughts in the chat, and we'll address it as we go. Those who've been with me the first 2 weeks, I like to have this be as conversational as possible. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So without any further ado, in thinking about sort of setting the stage for our conversation about the 3 Ds of Blackness today and the mark of Cain, I want to begin with this visual. This is a portion of what's known as the slave dungeon, and this is the so-called point of no return. This is where those of us who are African American or of African descent in the African diaspora, our ancestors passed through doors to enter into the hulls of ships, to be transported across the ocean as conscripted. I begin with this image because what's often not known is that many of these slave dungeons, these points of no returns, were in the basements or beneath the foundation churches. So part of the question is, how in the world, how in the name of all that is holy, could one have a point of no return beneath a sanctuary, beneath a church? You may have gathered from some of our conversation over the last 2 weeks, the only way to get to that kind of perverse architecture is to have a deeply flawed and racially problematic view of the Bible and of Christ. And that was really one of our first things that we wanted to emphasize. That within the context of American election, which we described a little bit as being a fruit of some of the approaches in Western Europe, that the myth of American election that conflates Christian chosenness with American destiny, and what I and my wife have called in some of our joint work, that is the lie of white supremacy. Embedded in this lie of white supremacy, as we our last conversation together, was this inflated view of whiteness, this belief that to be white is to be pure, is to be whole, to somehow embody the best of God's attributes. That bad theology produces a set of bad political paradigms. And one of the main fruits of that will be our focus for sessions 3 and 4, as if whiteness gets portrayed in this kind of idyllic, holy way, then its antithesis, or black, then gets all of the negative attributes. And so part of why one can see no contradiction between a point of no return beneath the sanctuary of a church is that those individuals who are beneath the foundation of the church are really beneath the humanity of those who are worshiping above. And we'll talk a bit more about how that gets constructed within our time together today. An important consequence of myth of American election and lows is what I talked about of the three I's of whiteness. This notion of whiteness connected to innocence, to industry, and to integrity. Again, to innocence, to industry, and integrity. So if our white brothers and sisters are portrayed in a certain way to be, again, innocent, industrious, full of integrity, then the problem can't be within them. It must be somewhere else. Part of the wicked genius of centuries of very bad biblical interpretation is that it created a narrative that said Black individuals, that we are the problem. So if whiteness is and Blackness is associated with being the problem, then that allows us to think about certain ways in which the United States cannot be unjust, and that any injustices that people of African descent complain about is not really a systemic problem, but it is our problem. It is our failures. And again, in this historical moment in which we find ourselves, we can hear this kind of rhetoric in many, many occasions, many to rehearse. As time permits later in this time together, I'll share two examples of how kind of the racialization and the Black folk being the problem emerges from this Mark of Cain story that we will investigate, and how that unfortunately gets invoked in some of the incidents of Black men in particular losing their lives at the hands of police officers in this country. Context of innocence, integrity, industry. I see you, Ms. Brooks, you put that in the chat for everyone. Thank you. As we think about this question of innocence, integrity, industry, and then making Black problem, the question becomes, how do we summarize that? My attempt to summarize that looks at how three texts from the primary get used. Again, as a reminder, the primeval are the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. The importance, I think, of so many of the architects of the caste system in America looking at the primeval history as a way of grounding these ideas about Blackness and therefore whiteness as well, is that if I put it in the primeval history, in the very origins of the human species, then what I do is make an argument that Blackness and whiteness reflect God's design. So rather than, as many scholars today would assert, that race is a social, that is, it is a thing that a bunch of folk got together and invented. If I ground it in the primeval history, in the very foundation of God's created order, then race and the caste system of ranking white on top, Black on bottom is literally what God meant when God said, "Let there be," and there was. Obviously, that's deeply problematic, but is deeply entrenched. And so it's important to think about race as a real category, air quotes, when many of these architects were creating this system. And the fact that they are viewed as real categories helps explain some of the reason why they endure so much to this day, and why so many of the negative policies and practices that we see not only within the church, but within our wider society have such traction. So the first text that I highlight in what we'll talk about today is this so-called Mark of Cain in Genesis 4. What I've argued and am arguing in my upcoming is that Genesis 4 and the Mark of Cain is a way of explaining the nature of Black people. That is, this gives us the character of Black individuals. If Genesis 4, the so-called Mark of Cain, gives us the character, then Genesis 9, which we'll look at next week, gives the social standing or location of Black individuals in this country. The so-called Ham, which we'll talk about next week, which actually does not exist in the Bible, At no point is Ham ever cursed. But again, why let good Bible get in the way with bad interpretation? This social standing of location emerges from the curse of Ham. And if I had to keep the alliteration of the C going, so Genesis 4 gives us the character, Genesis 9 gives us the cast. As Genesis 9 tells us during this particular kind of racialized interpretive tradition, that Black folk belong on the bottom. And so anytime Black folk rise up from the bottom, then we are violating the divine. So again, as I mentioned, I think in our last conversations, notion of DEI being didn't earn it, for me is again a poisonous for this racialized interpretation of the curse of Ham, puts us at the lowest caste. Then the third and final piece, and we talked a bit about this one in our first class, and we'll revisit it very briefly at the end, is the so-called Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. If you may remember, we had a map during our first session that had color codes of red, yellow, and green representing the descendants of Shem, Ham. And in that kind of depiction, Ham gets the continent of Africa. So Black folks' place of origin, or if we keep the C, the continent out of which we emerge. The caste in Genesis 9 that we are to occupy, and Genesis 4 gives us the character of Black individuals. Those three texts, in my mind, work together to create this nexus, this really net of oppression has been so much a part of the African experience in the diaspora in the Western world. Saw that Ms. Williams put in the chat, how do the systems stood up by cultures like India pull from or align to what has been established biblically? Yeah, excellent question. There are two ways that people have answered that question that I think tie into what we're looking at here. In one kind of resource that I believe I may have mentioned in the past, but if not, I'll certainly invoke her here, Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. I think is an excellent and a approachable read that gets at some of these issues. Not from a theological standpoint, where Ms. Williams' question is pointing, but at least from a social and sociological standpoint. The two ways of aligning, number one, is if the Bible is true, which we as followers of Jesus Christ affirm that it is true, then what God has said about these matters is settled. One of my wife's favorite verses from the Psalms is, "Forever, O Lord, your word is in the heavens." So this sense of the immutability of God's word also relates to the notions of caste, which is that your caste is largely immutable. That is, it cannot be changed. There's nothing you can do to escape your caste. So for example, and I won't use the language so as not to offend, and especially in case there are children on the line, it was said in the 60s by leaders such as Malcolm X, that what do you call Black man with a PhD? Well, the same thing you would call him in any other line of work, that racial derogatory or label. So that's one connection, right? This immutability. No matter how far one moves, the caste, that is your standing, is immutable. Secondly, it is also generational and transferable. So what we'll look at in a moment with both the mark of Cain in Genesis 4, the next week in Genesis 9, is that these curses are allegedly transferable, so that everyone who bears Black skin of Cain. So we are in a sense trapped by this. And so I'll make myself a note when we look at Genesis 10 for next week. A scholar named Stephen Haynes talks about this nexus of interpretations that allows these three texts to be blueprints for how society gets organized. So for me, Ms. Williams, I think that those texts working together with the biblical idea and the notions of caste that we see. I saw, it looks like it's Moss put in the chat, Isabel Wilkerson book, and then the movie that was made as well. I believe the movie is called Origin. if I remember correctly. Ms. Gunter as well, saying that she recommends Cast as well as a very good read. Absolutely, particularly for these kinds of issues. I think it's a good book to have. She was actually, who are here in the Atlanta, Georgia area. She was actually here, I guess, last October and spoke at church in Decatur. So I don't know if she'll be back in this area, but if she is back, I also recommend hearing her speak if you don't get a chance to read the book or watch the movie that was mentioned. So again, so these three texts of Genesis 4, Genesis 9, Genesis 10 become part of the foundation for this. How I've tried to summarize kind of the constructions of Blackness in these texts is, what I call the 3D. So the first is this notion that Black are somehow inherently dangerous. Here, the dangerousness gets expressed not only in arguing about what we are, also about how we are a threat to the safety of white citizens. Right, so dangerousness not only says something about who we are, but it is also connected to how we are allegedly a threat to white citizens, to the safety and the law and order of America. So again, unfortunately, our news cite examples of this dangerousness and so many encounters, whether it's a sister like Breonna or a brother like Michael Brown, or from my generation, someone like a Rodney King, from my parents' generation, the Emmett Till, and so many others that we don't have time to invoke. This notion that somehow they are so dangerous that they have to be met with violence to protect the citizens is one of the poisonous fruits of this construction. So that's dangerousness. Indeed, that I kind of think summarizes a lot of what's going on here is this question of being deviant. And the idea here behind deviance is this idea that Black folk are incapable of attaining certain standards of both intellectual accomplishment and moral development. Right? Again, deviance is this idea that we are incapable of reaching certain standards or benchmarks of intellectual accomplishment or of moral development. We'll see throughout narratives about the period of our enslavement notions that if left alone, Black folk could do no good, and that the best of our poets, the best of our music, the best of our intellect fall so far short of alleged white standards that there is really no reason to even talk about what we can or cannot accomplish as Black individuals. The third D, is this notion of depravity or being depraved. Here, this depravity comes up most often in context of violence and morality. There's a scholar that we'll talk a bit about in our final session, David Whitford, who talks about this idea of the hypersexuality of the Black African and how there's the type that develops in literature starting around the 15th and 16th centuries that endures, frankly, throughout the 20th, and I would argue even into the 21st century, that describes Black folk as being sort of inherently, I'll use a nice King James word, lascivious, which means we're likely to naturally inclined to engage in drug and alcohol abuse, to engage in inappropriate sexual relationships, to lack the decorum to order our society. These notions of the 3Ds will emerge from certain ways in which these biblical texts get misinterpreted and then applied to race. So these three texts, these 3Ds. The last piece, and we won't spend a lot of time on it in our time together today, but I did want to flag it as something that I think has a profound impact upon our current moment. Is that often these theological concepts, as horrible as they are, they don't as strongly affect Black life until they find some social foothold. For me, and part of my background is in law and having practiced law for over a decade to biblical scholarship in the academy. I'm particularly interested in the ways in which these constructions of blackness get deposited in the law. And once they get deposited in the law, they go through what I named here as a refining process, which allows legal conceptions of blackness to be saturated in these theological lies, these biblical misappropriations. So that from slave codes to executive orders we're enduring today, there is a pattern of saying Black people do not belong among the class of citizens and were never intended to be among the class of citizens when this nation was formed. There I'm summarizing the infamous Dred Scott case from 1857, which declared that the so-called Negro was never intended to be covered by the word citizen in this country. And I think that has profound impact on the kinds of battles we have fought for centuries. We're fighting again regarding our context. I saw in the chat, looks like it's that Miss French asked, is there a connection between and/or an origination of theory and this history in caste? I would say yes. I understand of the connection between these, absolutely. So that part of the idea is, and this is a horrible analogy, but it's the first one that came to mind. Dogs bark. And if I expect a dog to speak perfect Sanskrit, that's my problem, not the dog's problem. And so one of the issues that gets developed and kind of, as my mom would say, goes to seed and flowers in these moments is a certain perception of whiteness and of blackness means that we cannot ask Black people to do certain things because it is beyond our nature. Part of why I think that becomes such a dangerous and powerful lie is how often within our own communities do we hear things like, oh, well, this Black person talks white, or why are you pursuing education white thing? The day internalizing some of those theories and some of those caste things, that somehow Black is portrayed as a monolith of nothing but degradation, depravity, deviance, etc. And as a result of that, then you get this sort of tiered structure, this caste system that I think Ms. French, your question's alluding to as well. Other kind of reference that talks a bit about this that is perhaps less accessible. I think a very dense read, but I'll read if one has the time and patience for it, is Ibram Kendi's book, where he looks at the ways in which kind of Aristotelian models of the world is stratified based upon what each person deserves. So if you're a great pianist, you should get the best piano. If you're an average pianist, you should get an average piano. If you're a bad pianist, you should get the worst piano. And so the idea is that people get what they deserve, and a society should be built in such as to encourage that. In my wife's discipline of psychology, they will talk about things like just world bias, that people generally get what they deserve. And that, to me, grows out of a certain kind of misunderstanding, of theology of God is not mocked, right? Whatever someone sows, I think gets perverted into this kind of just world bias. And then when you label that or attach that to caste and deviance theory, et cetera, I think the churnings that we see in our society now take on a different light. So that was sort of what came to mind, Ms. French, to your question. I don't know if there's any other thoughts you have, but certainly please feel free to follow up if something else was triggered by that. So that's kind of the framework, or in this case, the literal framework that I want to lay as we dive into a specific or case study and how the story of the marketing and the 3Ds develop. So as you can see on the screen, this is an artist's rendition of the story of Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel, as many of you may know, takes place in Genesis 4. And it's a story where Cain and Abel are brothers. and they are asked to bring an offering, or they bring an offering to God. God is pleased with Abel's offering, displeased with Cain's offering. The biblical text does not tell us why God likes one offering versus the other. There have been many trees have died in service answering that question, but the text is silent on that, at least in the text that we normally read. Cain invites his brother Abel out into a field where he kills him. As you see in the artist's depiction, there's an assumption that Cain and Abel are both white men. If you remember in our first session, I talked about the Bible being an Asiatic or African and Asiatic text, that the majority of action in the Hebrew Bible takes place of Africa and Asia. But in the racialized misinterpretation of these texts, there's an assumption that the people are white. That becomes important because part of how we get blackness as a judgment assumes that the people who are in these stories are actually themselves white individuals. As the story of Cain goes on, God returns and confronts Cain and asks him, "Where is your brother?" And Cain responds with the famous, "I don't know, my brother's keeper." There then proceeds to be a mini trial where God judges Cain guilty, and as part of his punishment, he is cast out of the garden. Cain then appeals to God and says, "That sentence is severe for me, it's too harsh, because if you throw me out, I'll be killed." God then assigns a mark for Cain, and then says that if anyone kills Cain because of this mark, they will be judged severely. Cain then leaves the garden, meets a woman that he marries, and they become the father and mother of a great society. So that's Genesis 4 in brief. Part of how the racialization gets invoked is about two things. Number one, how in the world did Cain learn to kill? Right? In Genesis 10 is that the first man and first woman, who eventually become known as Adam and Eve, eat from a tree and lie to God about it. The very next chapter, we have fratricide. That is one brother killing another brother. And scholars and commentators from Jewish and Christian with, well, how did that happen? Where did this sudden acceleration of evil enter the human story? Then the second thing that happens, going back to our conversation last week of heroes and villains, this story becomes the first prototype for the hero-villain story. Abel becomes the first great hero, and Cain becomes the first great villain. And one can imagine it's kind of where we have been in our time together. If this story gets received back in racialized context, then Abel becomes the first hero, therefore the first great white human being. Cain becomes the first black person, and therefore the first villain. I apologize that this text is actually in Hebrew and English. I thought I put both translations here. What I want to look at were three passages that focus, for me, are footholds for where blackness gets constructed. So Genesis 4, verse 1 says, "Now Adam knew Eve, Chava, his wife. Then she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. Then Eve says, I have acquired an ish et Hashem. I have acquired from the Lord." Now, we will not get deep into biology, but I'm sure many of us can testify through personal experience or through studies that typically when one gives birth, one does not give birth to a man, gives birth to a boy. So the question that many commentators wrestle with is why the Bible used the word ish, a man, which is often applied to a full grown. Why does it use that term in reference to Cain? Whenever there are gaps in the biblical text. You can imagine that commentators and scholars often fill it in very interesting, sometimes insightful, sometimes very dangerous ways. This is one of those very dangerous ways. One of the arguments that arises is that Cain is born not as a child, but as a full-grown man. Therefore, it is assumed that since that is not the normal course of human reproduction, that somewhere in the context of Cain's biological origin story, we encounter another spirit, a non-human who impregnates Eve. And the argument that grows in Jewish and then later Christian tradition is that Cain's dad is actually the devil and the devil's minions. So the reason why Cain becomes a full-grown human being at birth is because it is not natural and is somehow demonic. Now, the text say this. So if anyone tells you that because Cain's father was the devil, they are misreading the text. But that tradition is actually one that gets preserved in the Christian New Testament. We won't read it for the sake of time, but in 1 John chapter 3, verses 7 through 12, the writer of 1 John 3 tells us there is this paradigm of the children of light to Abel and the children of darkness that belong to Cain. In one of the Greek traditions that gets translated into our English Bibles, Cain is described as being of the evil one, of the devil. Now, the writer of 1 John is talking not about some biological origin story, but rather about spiritual state. That if Abel, who brought the first acceptable sacrifice, is pleasing to God, then Cain, who brings the first unacceptable sacrifice, must be his opposite, must move from being the righteousness to the wickedness of Cain. So what ends up happening is the metaphor of devilishness gets applied literally and read back into the story of Cain's origin, so that Cain is not fully human, but somehow half human, half divine, and in this case, a demonic divine. The one final sort of scriptural foothold for this notion of the devilishness of Cain and his origin story happens in Genesis 6. So before the famous flood story begins, there's a story told in Genesis 6 of the so-called Nephilim, which is this story of a group of people who are half angelic beings, half human. And so there seems to be a tradition that develops in Genesis 6 of divine beings mating with human, producing a race of giants. And so that story gets read back into the Cain story as well. Saw a wow from the Ray of Hope. Then I saw in the chat for us. So interesting to think about things we have taken for granted. Cain and Abel being thought of as white, and how did to kill? Yes, absolutely. And so again, the notion that the mark, which we'll get to in a moment, being blackness, assumes that that would stand out. If Cain is white and his skin suddenly turns black, then we can make an argument about that. In the contrast, however, if Cain and Abel are both black, both brothers in two senses of the word, then if the mark is blackness, does it really stand out? And so there are various Black religious traditions that we may have a chance to look about later today or closing session, where Black religious traditions will say it can't be that Cain was turned black because he was already black. So if there is a skin color associated with a judgment of violence, it has to be white skin. And so we'll see that in a number of traditions. The scholar Nyasha Jr., article about 4 years ago, where she talked about the mark of Cain as whites and traces some of that history in Black religious traditions. I saw Miss Williams put in the chat a question. Was Abel considered the same age and seen as an adult male? Were they the same age? Yeah, good question. So at this moment of their birth, there's no indication that Abel was born as an adult male, that his birth story reads kind of typical one. The question then becomes, how much time elapses between their birth in Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, and then the scene that happens starting in verse 4. Again, the Bible doesn't give us details on that. The assumption is that some time elapsed, such that they could grow some form of maturity. There are any number of traditions that will argue that Abel was the younger brother. So part of what makes the story doubly offensive and Cain doubly devilish or deviant is that an older brother killed brother. And so that there's a thread that we'll see out the Hebrew Bible, that younger siblings are often preferred than who are often the child of promise in biblical narratives. And so some would argue that the age discrepancy, Cain older, Abel, feeds into that story or into that narrative of the preference for the younger. And it also adds to the egregiousness of Cain's crime that he now killed a younger brother, who presumably was less strong, less equipped, perhaps even more naive, so that the violence that he inflicted upon us was amped up in that context. But yes, that's traditionally how you'll see that age question interpreted in rabbinic and in early Christian traditions. All right. So this first foothold of Cain, the usual story of him being born or of acquiring a male in Ish, suggests something about potential deviance. Verse 8, which is what we talked about, is the sudden murder. Here again, the reception of this in 1 John 3 speaks to this notion of fratricide, or the murder among brothers, as a kind of a self-evident sign of the inherent dangerousness and danger, right? That what could be worse than killing your own family member? And certainly those of us who are from families, have siblings, can resonate with why this would be a particularly heinous crime. I saw your thank you, Ms. Williams. You're most welcome. And so in this context then, Cain, for some reason, somehow persuades his brother to go out into this field, which is what you see in verse 8. So this dangerousness, this depravity gets expressed in the first murder. After the first murder, we can see, okay, these verses can give us Cain villain. We can argue that the reception of Cain, when we get to 1 John 3, okay, he's a bad guy. But how do we get to be black? Because none of these texts get us there. There's a anti-black racist way. There is a way. That's what verse 15 provides us. So as mentioned in the brief overview of the text, Cain is to be thrown out, and he's afraid that if he gets thrown out, he'll be killed. So verse 15 begins, "V'yomer Hashem that is, says to the Lord, therefore, if anyone who kills me, they will find me. And what will happen to me is use paraphrase of that. And he says, God says, then anyone who finds you, I will pay them sevenfold. That is, this is an image that they will be judged if they do something harmful to Cain. And the Lord, verse 7, Vayasim Hashem l'Cain ot. So they placed upon Cain a sign, a mark, such that hakoot oto kol motzo. That is, so anyone who strikes him, anyone who finds him will not strike him. The verb that means to smite, to kill, to somehow do physical harm to. So the idea here that the mark of Cain gets flipped from a sign of protection to assign judgment and villainy. Again, I want to say that clearly again. The biblical narrative says the mark of Cain is a sign of divine protection. In the racialized interpretation of this text, it becomes a sign of divine judgment and villainy. So, what is again to be a sign of divine protection instead gets completely flipped in this racialized narrative. Part of why we know this was a protective mark is the story of Cain does not end with this story, because it goes out of Eden, and there he builds a civilization. There is no evidence of judgment against Cain beyond his obvious leaving from the con of Eden. Saw Ms. Hogues putting the stat in the chat. Excuse me. Thank you for that, because I was wondering how this turned into lynchings, etc. Yeah. So once one perverts this mark as being a sign of divine protection into a sign of judgment, then if they are already deviant and devilish, as we saw in verse 1, if they are indeed dangerous and depraved, as we saw by the murder of a brother, then of course, if God judged them and marked them this way, clearly we have a divine mandate, or at least to treat them in violent ways if we find them guilty of a crime. And one of the things that we won't have time to do today is when we study the Hebrew of these texts, Genesis 4 has a lot of terminology that is similar to a legal proceeding. So there is a sense in which Cain is, which is part of why my interest in law in these texts, I think, why they come together the way that they do. Two last things just to say about this text. Again, it's helpfully put in the chat the reminder about the mark of Cain shifts from a sign of divine protection to a sign of divine judgment. The second thing, the Hebrew word that is sign or mark, ot, we have no idea what this really means. It appears multiple times in Scripture. There is no connection between the word ot, sign, and skin color. That is a racialized assumption of this text is. The reason the ot gets connected with some kind of physical appearance is the assumption that the mark of Cain had to be visible, such that others, when they saw Cain, would somehow recognize he's off limits. Again, we have no idea what the mark actually was, but it's reasonable to assume it had to be physically visible and recognizable. So therefore, we understand that if someone saw it, they keep their hands off of him. The second thing about the mark of Cain, there is no evidence from this text that the mark of Cain is transferable. So if the mark of Cain is clearly visible, attaches to Cain, there is no evidence that this mark gets transferred to his descendants. For the racialized madness of the mark of Cain representing blackness to work, has to be a permanent marker, which the text says, right? In fact, it always uses the pronoun for masculine, that it's always about Cain and Cain alone. Saw in the chat, Miss Gore wrote, "This is absolutely helpful to see the origin, how the truth has been twisted for centuries. Most people don't know or understand the paradigm within." Absolutely, absolutely. That part of the issue is if you've ever thought or heard of black skin as being a sign of divine judgment, part of how the legacy of Cain is on. And part of how this legacy lives, and just do two quick examples, is how quickly this spread within American context. So on the screen, you see a famous poem by one of my heroines or heroes, Phyllis Wheatley, famous poet of the 18th century. And one of her most famous works is this text on being brought from Africa to America. What I want to draw your attention to, let me see if I can zoom in on it to make it a little easier, is the last half of this stanza. Beginning in the line, some view our sable with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. In addition to the beautiful wordsmith that she is, the notion that their color, or our color, is a diabolic, right? Diabolic being connected to devilish. So by the time Phyllis Wheatley arrives in the 18th century, this association of the mark of Cain with Blackness is so much a part, he understands it and can use it. And I think in a very, very subtle way, she critiques it by the last two sentences. Remember, Negroes black as Cain. Again, explicit connection of Negroes, which is, again, what Black folk were called in this time period. Black as Cain. Connection, again, to Genesis 4. May be refined and join the angelic train. Part of that last line, I think Phyllis Wheatley is very subtly and very powerfully arguing, even if we accept this notion that Blackness is connected to the mark of Cain, does not the blood of Christ cut us from that? Is not Calvary's cross powerful enough to allow us to join this angelic train? So rather than us being permanently outcast from the kingdom and relegated to abusive positions within the American empire, as it was being constructed in this colonial context, is there not another way of understanding this? And so I use this example just the ways in which this notion of Blackness and the mark of Cain was so pervasive that Phyllis Wheatley could talk about it in a way that her audience would have. I saw Ms. Williams put in the chat question, how do we consider these Hebrew interpretations from the text if the Israeli culture was infiltrated by the Germans to establish whiteness as the dominant culture, being the chosen people in the Bible? Yeah, good question. So if I understand your question properly, Ms. Williams, is there are two kinds of interpretive moments that we have to consider. So the first is, what did Jewish individuals understand the Hebrew Bible to mean prior to the kind of age of European colonization? Then the second is what you're describing, which is, what does this look like post kind of European colonization, and your phrase of when the Israeli culture was infiltrated by the Germans to establish whiteness. Yeah, so let's take them each in turn. The first question of Cain's race in kind of pre-colonial Jewish interpretations. In pre-colonial Jewish interpretation, there is very little conversation about the race of Cain, or even the color of Cain. The primary concern in these early contexts is trying to figure out, how did Cain come to murder? And secondly, how is the mark visible? Right, that it had to be visible, so the argument goes, but the text doesn't tell us what that visibility looked like. So the kind of racialized interpretations of it don't really exist in early kind of Jewish and early Christian interpretations. Where you do of it is in this diabolic or demonic connection, where people will say darkness represents evil, but there, darkness and blackness as race are not synonymous. So that's kind of one historical moment. The second moment, which is what you were raising about the question of Israeli culture and Israeli culture. Absolutely. So by the time one gets to the age of colonization, and this ties in a little bit to Mr. Brown's question. So I'll read his question because I think I can collapse my response. So Mr. Brown puts in the chat, the racialized assumption that Cain represented black and Abel represented white. Who does Seth represent? Absolutely. So within the context of early Christian thought, then it gets kind of put on steroids, or the volume gets amped up significantly to get to, again, the sort of 16th century forward. There's a question of what do we racialized map? So if Cain becomes black and Abel is white, what is Seth? Well, part of the answer to that question is these three figures get mapped onto Genesis 10. Where Seth is the father through many generations of Shem, who becomes what we would now call the Middle East or Jews at one point. Ham gets associated with Cain, and we'll talk about orchard logic that gets Cain and Ham to be connected, becomes associated with Blackness in the continent of Africa. Then the third gets associated with Japheth, who then gets associated with Europe and whiteness. So these three types of people, Seth, Shem being Middle Eastern Israeli, some points Jewish, Cain associated with Ham becomes associated with Blackness. Then Abel gets associated with Japheth and connected to whiteness. It becomes a kind of racialized map. Embedded in this question, and there's a book by J. Cameron Carter. So J. Cameron Carter, Carter, who does Race, a Theory Account. One of the things that this brother who was at Duke at the time talks about ways in which otherness was constructed both in relationship to Jewishness and then ultimately to Blackness. So some of the strategies that were used to other Jewishness within kind of European context get applied to Blackness. And its story, and unfortunately we don't have time to really unpack it now, is through Jacobson in his book, The Alchemy of Race, talks about how Jewishness has become hotly contested issues. And so there's a certain point, going back to Ms. Williams' question about kind of the infiltration by Germans and Aryanism, where Jews become white in order to justify certain kinds of ideas, not by Nazi Germany, obviously, but within certain frameworks within what we would now call Christian nationalism, right? So if Jesus has to be white, conversation, then Jews, the lineage out of which he emerges, also have to be white, because you can't have a non-white person as the face of white supremacy and the lies that it promulgates. So that's a very quick version of a very messy story. You're welcome, Mr. Brown. Saw the chat, Miss Brooks asked, is modern term from 15th century? The short answer is yes. That when we begin to think about race being connected to color, and that connection to skin color being able to tell us something about nature, and that there are different types of human beings, if human beings at all, then yes, it's really in that 15th to 16th century that you begin to get this idea of race. Within the Americas, yes, it's 17th and 18th century when the experiment that we now call America begins to take shape. You'll get questions of like polygenesis, which there are actual human and subhuman races that can be designated by both geographic and kind of phenotypical characteristics, meaning skin color, hair, etc. But the book I mentioned by J. Cameron Carter, Race, a Theological Account, it gives a lengthy kind of intellectual history of that as well. Again, if that's something that is particularly to you, I recommend that book as well. Two quick things, as I realize our time is rapidly moving. This is another example of how the mark of Cain permeates so much of antebellum America. What you see here is an excerpt from a speech by Brigham Young related to the our Mormon brothers and sisters, where he talks about, and I won't read all of it, but what's important here is the ways in which the mark of Cain, by the time we get to the mid-19th century, comes to reflect not only Black skin, but Black phenotypical characteristics. That is the last thing you see underlined, that the mark upon him, which is the flat nose and the Black skin. And before that, he was one of the more pejorative descriptions of being uncouth, uncomely, etc. And hopefully within that kind of description, you see the resonances of the 3Ds that we talked about earlier, of dangerousness, depravity, and deviance. And so Mormonism is its own kind of whole sort of Pandora's box, if you will, of religious traditions. But they're uniquely kind of American religious movement. And so to me, what's often fascinating about studying Mormonism are the ways in which the racial understandings of Scripture infiltrate and infect their kind of early theological constructions. I think it was in the 1970s where certain prohibitions on Black participation in the Mormon church were just lifted. So if you're my age or older, you were alive when Black folk were allowed to be fully admitted within certain contexts of the Mormon church. So this legacy, again, lives in very real ways. I want to do in our final 4 minutes is look at the so what of this within two current events, or relatively current events. I meant the beginning of our time together, my interest in how some of these ideas get incorporated into our legal system and affect some of the ways in which African Americans, both men and women, but in this case, men, interact with our criminal justice. The picture on the top left is part of the infamous LAPD assault on Rodney King. I was in high school when this happened. And this was a moment that forever shaped me. And those who are in and around my age and were in this country at this time may have a similar sentiment. I was among those people who thought, it's on videotape, surely this brother will get justice. I was shocked by his acquittal and the acquittal of the police officers. In some ways, what happened here held my own interest into going to law school to try to understand how this all happened. The picture on the bottom right of the screen is, for instance, of Michael Brown, which happened about a little over a decade ago now. And it was one of the sort of catalysts for the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the sort of 21st century civil rights movements that we're dealing with right now. Why I put these two on the screen is the language that the police officers used in connection with Rodney King and Michael Brown harken back to what we've been looking at. Again, these incidents were separated by about 25 years, separations of miles. And I am confident, although I have not proven it, but I am confident that neither of the officers involved in the Rodney King incident or Michael Brown's murder were studying the kinds of things we are studying. But in each case, the assaulting officer described Rodney King and Brown as demons, as devil, as monstrous, as non-humans, threats to these officers' lives, and these officers were scared. These men, despite how many officers were with them, these one Black men could overpower all of the LAPD officers or all of the officers in Missouri. If you look carefully at that language, it is hard not to hear the 3Ds and the legacy of the mark of Cain literally coloring these incidents. And so part of the vicious legacy of these things is that they keep popping up when we hear the language of how Black folk are described when we are encountering law enforcement. I saw Ms. Frank chat, and if with grace, I'll let her question be our last word before we transition. She wrote, "I am really struggling with how a thought, idea, belief by a few can become so ingrained in the masses with no real substance." Yes. The very short answer I will give, to keep us too much longer, is it was the right few who taught the many that made it become a part of the fabric of America. What I mean by saying it was the right few who taught kind of the appropriate many that allowed it to grow as it did is that these ideas were held by men and women, but by particular, who were presidents of universities, pastors of the leading church, governors, mayors, councilmen of the congressional princes of the colonial era. Then when this nation got founded, they were the ones who drafted these documents. So it was a part, literally, of the air we breathe. My wife and I often use the expression of swimming in racist waters. So the idea is it doesn't take a lot to get momentum going. The second thing about how it became so popular is that these were standard interpretations of Scripture. They were framed in the way that said, if you're not questioning my interpretation, you're questioning the truth of Scripture. And maybe I'll make a note to do it within our next class. But what I often do when I do the full version of this course, and if I come back and do a more extended version and walk through it, is that most God-fearing, Bible-believing Christians can say yes to 4 of the 5 premises. So, for example, does one say, yes, God created all human beings? Yes. Do we believe God gave us Scripture as a reliable record of who God is and how God wants us to relate to people? Yes. Does the Bible give us understanding on how to set up? Yes. So far, we have all said yes, and I don't know that many of us would object. Then I add the 4th layer, which is where the objection from my end. Well, therefore, the racial hierarchy part of that divine design. Well, it's that 4th step that I raise questions, and the work that I'm doing here is to try to get us as a people and our white brothers and sisters as well, and say, hey, we can say amen on steps 1, 2, and 3, but step 4 is where you went off logical deep rails. And it is the live white supremacy that shaped your interpretation more than the Bible shaping that view. Thank you. I saw a couple comments, and yes, we have 1 week left. With your permission, I saw one last comment from Ms. Gunter, and I'll close us out on that before we head into our small groups. Ms. Gunter, the Bible became racialized. It was an intentional move to disregard the geography of the stories in the text. I guess I wonder why white intellectuals have not come to the same conclusions about the color or race of the people in the stories or text. Yes. So to your first question, it was absolutely. Part of the question is why white intellectuals have not come to the same conclusion is because before we can get to the logic of the argument, we have to address the perversion and power of the heart. What I mean when I say before we get to the logic of the argument of the mind, address the perversion and power of the heart, is that all of these racialized interpretations are now so embedded in the way America thinks about itself, the way American Christians think about themselves, that to ask this question that I'm asking here is to literally be assumed I am threatening their Christ, their Christianity. In fact, I'm insulting their honor. Quick story. I was giving a presentation, differently tailored, but coloring some of the same kind of information. And a white brother who was in the class erupted in anger and accused me of all kinds of ungodly things, from being racist to being a race baiter to just trying to pervert the gospel, try to start a race war. Because no right-thinking slave owner would be brutal to his slaves. No rational person would believe any of these texts, have these racialized. And in listening to this person talk, I just pushed back and said, well, tell me, what do you think about some issue? And he gave his response and said to this person, do you realize that is actually what they said in the 19th century? That your argument from 2023 is exactly what they in 57. So yes, Ms. Brooks, I am deviant because I'm daring to raise some of these questions. But part of why many white intellectuals have not addressed this is that to address it requires a fundamental re-examination of who they are and how they have chosen to believe a lie about themselves. James Baldwin said that whites refuse to change the images of blacks on television. They change the image of themselves. And I think hit the nail on the head on that one. And I think that contributes to what we are having today. Well, beloved family, you've been with me for 3 weeks, so I consider you family. If you consider me family, but I consider you my family. We have reached 8:37. So again, I thank you so much for all of your engagement and your great questions. And I understand, I hope there's a tradition that this conversation will continue. So I go to the website. There is an opportunity for small groups to meet, and I think I saw it pop up. So you can go on to the website if you're not already logged in, and click onto that link and continue the conversation for your small groups. As I mentioned before, if you have questions or ideas that pop up during your small groups, please let us know so we can make sure we address them in our last session. And as always, Hale was fond of reminding you that you can worship with the Ray of Hope family on Sunday mornings in person or via the internet, on Facebook, and on the Ray of Hope website. Again, I thank you so much for your time, your attention, and your great comments and words. I enjoyed this conversation immensely. Look forward to continuing in the next and final session on the Bible, Blackness, and Race in America. God bless you all, and we'll see you next week.